Now let's turn our focus to Nepal. It's a small Himalayan nation of about 30 million people. It's wedged between two highly populated behemoths, India and China. Nepal is prized for its labor force, among other things, specifically its military manpower. We're talking about the famed Gorkha regiments. From the days of British colonization, the Gorkha people of Nepal and India have made a name for themselves as able warriors. It's honestly a mixture of martial traditions, job opportunities, and a hint of British racist thinking. But that mixture has resulted in a legendary reputation for the famed Gorkha regiments in the Indian Army. And for years now, China has coveted this military connection. This year, China is reportedly keen on recruiting its own Gorkha regiment. And the alarming part is this: it may get the chance to do it, because Nepal's government has stalled India's annual recruitment of Gorkha troops. Why is this happening? Our next report brings you the details.
The landlocked nation of Nepal is at a crossroads. Almost literally, when looking at its geography, it sits high in the Himalayas between India and China. The nation of 30 million is heavily dependent on its neighbors for everything from supplies to employment. Where do the Nepalis seek jobs outside their country? In a variety of fields, but there is one historical employment avenue: the Indian Army. The Indian Army has something called the Gorkha regiments. These were created during the British Raj. The British had a racist trope about martial races that could be used to fill their colonial armies, and the Gorkhas were considered a prominent martial race. Gorkha people from both Nepal and India were recruited. After India became independent in 1947, there was a question about the Gorkha regiments. What would be done with them? Nepal, India and Britain came up with the tripartite agreement. Under it, the UK retained 4 Gorkha regiments. India kept 6. And Nepal's Gorkha people would be readily recruited by the two nations. 7 decades later, Gorkha troops still hold a place of honor in the Indian Army, and deservedly so. Over the course of decades, the Gorkha regiments have proved invaluable. They have served with distinction during all of India's wars. Of course, it isn't a one-way street. The Indian Army recruiting Gorkha soldiers has helped Nepal too. It provides employment for rural areas. Retired soldiers earn a good pension. The Indian Army runs a welfare organization for its former troops as well. Overall, it's a time-tested way to maintain good economic and social ties between the two countries. But this hallowed tradition may be at risk. This year, Nepal might not send Gorkha troops to the Indian Army. The government in Kathmandu has stalled recruitments. The reason they've given is India's Agnipath scheme. It's a new armed forces recruitment scheme brought in by the Indian government last year. Under this, recruits will have a trial period of sorts for 4 years. After that, only a fourth of the troops will be absorbed into the Indian Army. The Indian government brought this scheme to try and curb its armed forces pension bill. But it means there's no guarantee that Nepal's famed Gorkha troops will get a job. This has upset Kathmandu, so Gorkha regiment recruitments have been stopped. But you may wonder, 1 out of 4 recruits is still better than none. Why would Nepal halt the entire process? Well, the answer might be Nepal's northern neighbor. China has been eyeing Gorkha regiments of its own for years, but Beijing's past attempts were always rebuffed. In 2020, Beijing conducted studies to see why Nepal's youth were drawn to the Indian Army. In particular, it wanted to know what the compensation was like. China has been trying to woo Nepal's government as well. It's steadily investing in Nepal and facilitating trade and technology. And now, with the Agnipath spat, China's time may finally have come. The entire scenario may end with Beijing finally getting its own Gorkha troops. And that would be a blow to India-Nepal ties. It would be a great shame for Indian and Nepali Gorkha regiments to one day face off against each other.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with East Africa, Rwanda and neighboring Uganda are facing floods. These two countries have been experiencing heavy rain since late March. In China, a heavy sandstorm has hit Xinjiang. It limited visibility and created a sand wall of sorts. Meanwhile, Russian cosmonauts performed a spacewalk to relocate an experiment airlock. Anytime an astronaut gets out of a vehicle while in space is called a spacewalk. And finally, what makes The 4th of May is significant. We're taking you back in history. On this day, Margaret Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The year was 1979. The Labour Party's government had collapsed. The UK was experiencing economic difficulties. Public opinion had swung in favour of the Conservatives, and Thatcher hit the nail right on the head. She promised to revive the economy by increasing taxes and balancing the budget. Now they call it Thatcherism. A Soviet journalist called her the Iron Lady, and while Thatcher evokes positive emotions from young Conservatives, she remains a divisive figure in the UK. Some see her as a Prime Minister who saved the country's economy. Others believe she destroyed livelihoods. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
There it goes.
Gorkha.
All right, bye-bye. Just flies beautifully.
Form a new administration, and I have accepted. It is, of course, the greatest honor that can come to any citizen in a democracy.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.